The valley was a wound in the earth where the wind didn't blow. We set up the dish on a flat rock near the water. Kibble was sweating, his no-future hoodie stained with grease and river mud. He didn't like this place. He kept looking at the tree-line like he expected the shadows to move. I didn't care about the shadows. I cared about the machine. As the old Windows XP startup sound echoed through the canyon, the laptop screen flickered violently. The air grew heavy, smelling of ozone and rotting leaves. Kibble adjusted his headset, his hands shaking. "The indexer is spiking," he whispered. "It's like it's hungry." I handed him the paper with my question. I hadn't written about the dog this time. I had written, "Did Alan kill Jody?" Kibble read the question and went pale. "I told you, man, don't ask about the past. It's a predictor, not a detective." I told him to run it anyway. He sighed and typed the code. The moment he hit enter, the river seemed to stop flowing. My phone didn't just beep. The screen turned bright red and stayed that way. The van's car battery began to hiss. On the screen, the typical I-97 didn't appear. Instead, the characters started spinning like a slot machine. They landed on E03. "Error?" I asked. Kibble was ripping his headset off. "Not an error. E03. It means the probability is inverted. It means the answer is happening and not happening at the same time. Look." Kibble pointed at the satellite dish. It wasn't pointing at the sky anymore. It had bent itself downward, aiming directly into the dark water of the run-along river. We heard a sound, a wet, rhythmic slapping against the rocks. Someone was walking up from the riverbank. In the dim light of the laptop, I saw a figure. It was tall, wearing a suit that looked like Jody's court attire, but the face was a blurred smudge of static. Stopped 10 feet away. Kibble scrambled into the van, locking the doors. I stayed. The figure tilted its head, and for a second, the static cleared. It wasn't Jody. It wasn't Alan. It was me, but my eyes were leaking dark oil. The next morning, I was back in the city for the first day of the trial. I felt like a ghost walking through the courthouse. Every time I passed a fluorescent light, it hummed and dimmed. My parents were there, clutching Alan's hands. He looked terrible, thinner, his skin the color of old parchment. When the prosecutor, Jody's old boss, started speaking, the microphone began to feedback. A high-pitched screech that made everyone cover their ears. Only Alan didn't flinch. He looked directly at me in the gallery. He didn't look like a brother anymore. He looked like a man who knew exactly what lived in that 3% error margin. When it was my turn to take the stand, the room felt freezing. The defense lawyer asked me to describe the night I found them. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words felt like sand. I looked at the court reporter, but she wasn't typing words. Her fingers were flying across the keys, but the screen showed only E03, E03, E03. I tried to say, "I saw a knife," but what came out of my mouth was a sound like a television between channels. The judge hit his gavel, but the sound was muffled, like it was happening underwater. I realized then that the machine hadn't predicted the future. It had overwritten my present. I visited Alan in the holding cell during the lunch break. No guards were around. The cameras were flickering, struggling to stay online. Alan sat on the bench, staring at the floor. "You went to the river," he said. It wasn't a question. I asked him how he knew. He looked up, and his glasses were cracked just like Kibble's. "When I held that knife," Alan whispered, "I wasn't in the hallway. I was in a place where the sun was black and the stars were made of noise. I didn't kill her, but I watched her get pulled into the static. I'm just the placeholder now." I got a text from Kibble that evening. It was just a photo of his van, abandoned and submerged in the river. No body, no equipment, just the neon sign, "No Future," floating on the surface of the water, still glowing. He had left a voicemail, but it was mostly 19 seconds of white noise. At the very end, his voice came through, sounding like it was miles away. "It's not a machine, it's a door, and you left it open. The 3% is coming through, and it's wearing our faces." I looked in my rearview mirror. A white van was following me. It had no driver. I broke into the evidence locker at the precinct that night. I work for the grid. I know how to bypass the electronic locks by causing a localized brownout. I found the bag containing the knife Alan had been holding. It wasn't a knife anymore. It was a shard of something that looked like glass but felt like frozen light. When I touched it, I saw the night Jody died. She wasn't murdered. She had answered her cell phone, and the signal had been too strong. It had literally unzipped her reality, leaving only a memory behind. A memory that Alan had tried to catch with his bare hands. The brownouts weren't just in Hilltop anymore. The entire state started to flicker. At the office, my screens were showing reliability reports that made no sense. The power wasn't being used by houses or factories. It was being sucked into a single point in the run-along river valley. I realized that the No Future machine was still running underwater, powered by the sheer momentum of the 3% error. Every time the lights flickered, a little more of our world was replaced by the static world. I saw my co-workers starting to blur at the edges. I drove back to the river. The water was boiling, glowing with a sickly blue light. The satellite dish was sticking out of the mud like a grave marker. I found the laptop. It was still running somehow. The screen was cracked, but the prompt was waiting. Query: will there be a tomorrow? My finger hovered over the enter key. I looked at the tree-line. My parents, Jody, Alan, and Kibble were all standing there, but they were made of flickering lines and gray noise. I typed one last thing into the machine before I smashed it. Calibration 100% reality. The lights went out for the last time. The silence at the river was louder than the boiling water. I stood over the smashed laptop, but the blue glow didn't fade. Crawled up my boots like glowing mold. I realized then that smashing the hardware was like breaking a mirror to stop a reflection. The image was already out there. I looked at the figures in the tree-line. My parents weren't moving. They were stuttering, their limbs snapping into different positions every time I blinked. Jody, I called out. Her static-filled form stepped forward. She didn't speak with her mouth. The sound came from my own car radio, 50 yards away. The grid is hungry, brother. It needs a ground wire. I drove back to the city, but the city wasn't there. Not entirely. Every third street lamp was gone, replaced by pillars of absolute darkness. People were standing on the sidewalks, perfectly still, staring up at the sky where the stars were flickering in a binary code. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a 19-second call from my own number. When I answered, I heard the sound of a heart beating, but it was metallic, rhythmic, like a cooling engine. The 3% wasn't just an error margin anymore. It was a physical space, a crack in the world that was widening every time someone looked at it. I went back to the jail to find Alan. The facility was in a state of localized brownout. The electronic locks were clicking rapidly, cycling through open and closed like a panicked heartbeat. I found his cell, but it was empty. Not just empty of a person, the cot, the sink, and the bars were gone. There was just a hole in the floor that led into a basement that didn't exist on the blueprints. I heard Alan's voice coming from the hole. "It's not a prison," he whispered. "It's a filter. They're sorting us. The 97% go to the dark and the 3%. We stay to watch." I remembered Alan's old job at the bottling plant. He had mentioned a discrepancy in the logistics weeks before the night in South Falls. I drove there, the white van still trailing me, always exactly 3 car lengths behind. Inside the plant, the assembly lines were running, but they weren't bottling water. They were bottling the gray noise from the river. Thousands of glass jars filled with swirling static, moving toward a shipping bay labeled Hilltop. The bad people the police thought Alan was involved with weren't criminals. They were technicians for something much older than the power grid. I found Jody's legal briefcase in the trunk of my car. I hadn't looked at it since the police returned it. Inside, the files weren't about court cases. They were maps of the power grid, marked with red ink. She had been tracking the leaks, places where reality was thinning out. One note was tucked into the back, handwritten in her frantic script. "If the voltage drops to 0, the door opens. If the voltage spikes to 100, we burn. We have to keep it at 97. The balance is everything." I looked up and saw the white van parked outside my window. The door opened. It wasn't Kibble who stepped out of the van. It was the 17-year-old kid from the gas station, the one with the black hair and the triple lip piercing. But he looked different, older, his eyes replaced by the same flickering CRT screens I'd seen in the van. "You missed a payment," he said, his voice echoing as if he were speaking through a long pipe. He held out a Hershey bar. When I took it, the wrapper felt like human skin. "The machine doesn't want your questions anymore," he whispered. "It wants your reliability report. It wants to know if you're ready to fail." I ran to my office at the energy sector. I needed the master controls. I needed to surge the grid and fry every transformer in the state to shut the door. But when I walked into the control room, my coworkers were all wearing white hoodies and black baseball caps. They were sitting at their desks, eating Hershey bars in perfect unison. On the giant monitoring wall, the map of the state was gone. It was just a giant, glowing E03. One of them turned to me. It was my boss, but his face was a smooth, featureless surface. "We've achieved 100% reliability," he said. "The noise is finally stable." The memory of South Falls hit me then. The left turn, I thought I remembered. I saw the hallway again, but this time the static cleared. Alan wasn't holding a knife. He was holding a cable, and Jody wasn't dead on the floor. She was being pulled into the wall, her body turning into streaks of light and data. Alan was trying to pull her back, his eyes glowing with that tiny spark of darkness. The darkness wasn't evil. It was the 3% of him that had already been converted. I hadn't walked into a murder scene. I had walked into a botched upload. I realized I was the only ground wire left, the only person who still saw the world as it used to be. I grabbed a high-voltage cable from the maintenance closet and ran to the main terminal. The no future sign appeared in the air before me, burning in neon purple. The figure that looked like me, the oil-eyed version, stood in my way. "If you ground the system," it warned, "you disappear. There is no version of you that survives a 100% reset." I looked at the screen. The probability of me succeeding was flickering between 0% and 100%. The E03 was screaming. I jammed the cable into the terminal. For a split second, I saw everything. I saw Kibble lost in a world of 1970s hardware. I saw Jody arguing a case in a courtroom made of light. I saw Alan finally letting go of the cable. The surge was absolute. The power grid didn't just fail. It vanished. I woke up in my car, parked on a dirt road outside Hilltop. The sun was rising. My phone was dead. I looked in the mirror, no oil in my eyes. But when I turned on the radio, all I heard was the sound of a heart beating. And on the passenger seat, there was a single Hershey bar and a note in my own handwriting that read,